Before we get to this conversation with Becca, I did want to open up with a little bit of a conversation, though, about what happened here in Texas yesterday, because we had our midterm elections, and it's sort of a good, still neutral, and some bad news when it comes down to what that sort of meant for the left and the growing working class movement in Texas. First, I just want to note at the very, very top that these were high turnout for Texas historically, midterm elections, not by massive percentage points. I believe this is from Texas Tribune. The 2018 midterm primary turnout was around 17.2% of voters, while the midterm primary in 2022, that just happened yesterday, was 17.5%. So there's an uptick, but it's not a big swing. And that is also, we're talking about less than 20% of registered voters in the state of Texas showing up for these primaries. So it's always important, I think, to sort of recognize the limitations, especially for the kind of politics that we're trying to build, right? Of primaries for really measuring these things. Like, obviously, like, primaries are the first hurdle if you want to get our people, on the ballot in the general election. But it's one of those things where there's a big disconnect between like popular opinion on certain things and the people who end up voting in these primaries, right? And it has to be a two-track kind of understanding of how to win that. But let's start with the good. Greg Casar, who was a DSA member, was endorsed until, unfortunately, just very, very recently, over having really unfortunate positions on Palestine. And I support the decision of DSA if we're going to uphold the kind of values and the movement that we're trying to build. He had ended up asking to not be considered for an endorsement anywhere, but effectively de-endorsing him. It was a very sad moment because I think that Greg really is a representative of a very incredible kind of pro-worker, future-facing politics that I would want to be seeing spring up all across the country. And it's sad, while I know plenty of people in the Austin DSA did incredible work on that campaign and where they're celebrating with him last night, it's sad that we can't put that up as a strong, win for the entire movement. But that's the reality. And again, I think that it was the right decision because we have to hold strong on Palestine. But dropping all the internal DSA stuff, I mean, this is a huge victory for progressive politics, not just in Austin, but in Texas in general. And I also think for the nation. I mean, Greg, I'm very much looking forward to. It looks like that's a pretty safe district when it comes to Democrats. It looks like he will be able to win in the general. A really great victory, not only because the person we wanted to win won and they won outright, so there's not going to be a runoff. He won and completely trounced all of his opposition. And for people who aren't familiar with internal politics in Austin, I mean, Greg is somebody who's extremely popular with working people. But as you can imagine, it's the pariah of the right wing and the Republican movement here, and even a lot of kind of centrist neoliberal Democrats. So despite all those forces and people who have a lot of ammo, if they want to say, look at the scary socialists running, blah, blah, blah. Despite all that money and effort by those people, he walked away with it, which I think is a testament not only to Greg's strength as a candidate, but the incredible on the ground movement that we saw here.
Yeah.
I'll just go down the list because, the other big kind of progressive race is between Cisneros and Cuellar down in South Texas. In one of those districts that's pretty fascinating, goes all the way to San Antonio to the border. But it looks like for that, there's going to be a runoff in May. And we had sort of hoped and wanted for Cisneros, if people aren't familiar, is a very, very progressive Bernie endorsed candidate. We'd wanted her to win outright against Cuellar, who was like one of the worst blue dog Democrats, undoubtedly the most conservative of Democrats. He's very much like the poster boy of the kind of argument that in certain parts of the country, you need to run people who are anti-abortion, people who are pro fossil fuels to the detriment of our environment and our community, et cetera, right? People who it's sort of like, why do you even have this person in Congress? Because they're basically going to vote against the vast majority of the Democratic Party's platform in power, right? you would hope that that would be a walk away, and it ended up being quite tight. So that's going to be a race to watch closely. But it's also like the reason this is sort of important, I think, not just for people who are following Texas politics, but also national politics, and particularly for people who consider themselves to be on the progressive side and even the socialist side, is very important because it could open up and be a very, very clear example of how we don't need to play this kind of footsie with reactionary right wing politics to win. Cisneros is, is a young person who has run like a very, very, I think would be fair to say, progressive campaign on social issues. This is not somebody who's timid about talking about women's rights to abortion. This is not somebody who's timid about talking about civil and human rights for our queer brothers and sisters and friends. This is somebody who speaks a kind of language, that is sort of representative of, a kind of, a growing national culture that is taking those issues very seriously. But she merges that, and this is where I think the key is. She merges that with extremely strong pro-worker, pro-people policies. I like Jessica. I support her, and I urge people to vote for her. She's not, for example, all the way on our side of being, a quote unquote, democratic socialist, dyed in the wool person, but certainly represents, a kind of extension of a Bernie Sanders and even Elizabeth Warren, movement within the Democratic Party that I think is a positive one. So we'll be watching that race very closely, and it's worth noting too. Sorry, I just wanted to note.
Well, I got a clip from Joy Reid.
Oh yeah, why don't you play that, and I can say some things after.
Yeah, this is their reaction here, which I thought was kind of in line with what you were saying.
I want to start with Julian Castro because I am fascinated by the Cisneros versus Cuellar race. And so I guess the question, given all that has happened around the issue of abortion in the state of Texas, do you have a sense of whether that issue motivated progressive voters to come out for Cisneros? And if you think that that is the case, what do you think that says about the strength of that issue and how it might play in the general?
Well, I think it did, Joy. And I mean, there are a couple of ironies here. One is that one, right? She has been very unabashedly pro-choice. She made abortion an issue in this campaign, pointed out that Representative Cuellar is the only anti-abortion Democrat in the entire Democratic caucus in the House of Representatives. So she didn't shy away from it. That's one thing. The other is there's been so much attention focused since the November 2020 election, since Donald Trump did a little bit better in South Texas than folks were expecting. So much attention focused on a perceived rightward shift in the South Texas counties that the 28th Congressional District includes. And yet, at the same time, both in 2020, Jessica Cisneros did very well, coming in within 4 points of, at that point, an 8-term incumbent. And now she's actually leading and could possibly win without a runoff against this 9-term incumbent, who is probably the most conservative Democrat in the caucus at this point. People may say that South Texas is going one way, but the results tonight, at least in the 28th Congressional District, seem to suggest that there is life for progressives there, and they have to be happy.
Yeah, and
what do you make of that?
Well, I'll just say one thing. That's an older clip, so it ends up that there's going to be a runoff. Once most of the votes that were sort of brought in South Texas, closer to those border regions versus in the San Antonio areas in the district, Cuellar was able to to make up some ground. But what do I make of that? I mean, I think that for the most part, I agree with Castro there. That there certainly is a lot of life for progressive politics there, particularly politics that really speak in a real way, to people's issues. I mean, like when I'm saying, for example, that Jessica is showing up, for working people and working class people's issues, we're not just talking about somebody who is, putting on a blue Oxford shirt and rolling up their sleeves. I mean, like really talking about the anxieties that people have over healthcare and wages and the inequality in our society. I think that I think that it's worthwhile, and I think that people should take the shift that they have seen in South Texas, very seriously. And I think that the argument that the progressive left should be making is not to ignore the fact that there has been a kind of inroads made with the GOP, but to actually say that we have a story, we have a movement that has also very much been sort of underrepresented in
Mhm.
elected officials from that region, and that we can pull those people away much easier than because what the Democrats, when you see people, it's funny because I talk about South Texas and the shift a lot because I think it really does show a kind of failure of the state Democratic Party here, thinking that they're just always going to get votes from Tejanos and Hispanic people in South Texas, right? We're seeing that that's not necessarily the case. And again, for people who aren't familiar, we're not talking about massive shifts in the sense that like some of these districts were necessarily flipping over to Trump. It was just that Trump was able to pick up support, and you have
In
seen.
those margins, I'm getting in those margins.
And that's like, that's ridiculous. I mean, that's Donald Trump, right? He shouldn't be able to get in there at all. But what I'm saying is that, like, so I talk about the slux. I think it is something worrying. I think people should pay attention to it. But what you will end up getting from a lot of people who are very much established in the Democratic Party is this kind of, well, this is why we need to run super right-wing Democrats down there.
Exactly,
and I'm going to tell you right now that like that is a disaster. Like it might even help you out in one election cycle or two as things maybe transfer. But you put yourself effectively you're hampering you're hurting your ability to be able to enact any kind of progressive legislation in office. And two, you're only sort of prolonging something that's inevitable because sooner or later people say like, well, why am I getting the half-assed Republican when we can get the full one, right? What
Yeah,
we
of
have to be
course.
able, what we have to be able to do is to not encourage those kind of shifts,
Yeah.
but rather put forward a much better vision that brings in all of those voters in a progressive direction. Anyways, I think that Cisneros certainly represents, that shift. And I think that that's the lesson that people should take, because if the lesson they take is that, oh, we've seen some movement in polling and things like that, so we need to basically get more conservative. I mean, that's a disaster, especially at
Yeah.
a time when the state, like if you get the Democratic Party going more conservative while the GOP is just going completely off the rails, I mean, that's a death sentence for people, frankly. And I don't mean to use hyperbole, but it is when you're talking about the abuse that people are facing when it comes to the right to abortion, comes to the abuse that people are facing because of trans issues here, the abuse that people are facing when it comes to major corporations coming in and taking advantage of folks and decimating communities, the abuse that we're facing right now because people like Greg Abbott and the state party GOP want to continue to enrich their friends at the expense of our ability to have electricity during storms, right? Like it is life and death kind of stuff. I think that it is important.
Yeah, and like the idea that Trump was popular with folks just because of the conservatism is such a jump, I think. Like
Mm.
like Trump was simultaneously more conservative and more liberal or caring than all the candidates, right? Like he spoke to everyone. We're not going to leave people in the street. To simultaneously, like there has to be some sort of punishment for abortion, right? Like the idea, but I think like all people got, they don't have a sense of like, where on the scale are you left and right? They're saying, are you going to say like, I don't give a fuck who Marco Rubio and Jeb Bush is, and look
Mm.
like you have big balls? That's why Trump won. Like I think fundamentally, but anyway.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot there, and if people wanted to get my fresh, reaction to that in 2020, you could go on Jacobin, called "Socialism Can Win in Texas." I didn't pick the title, but that's what it was called. Not that I don't disagree with that necessarily, but you can go find that, and I have some sort of hot takes on as to what happened with Trump there. But before we get to this interview, I did want to also mention, because we had them on the show, and they were two campaigns that I highly supported, both Andrew Harrison and Bob Leibel, here in the Austin area. Unfortunately, were not successful. I think the campaigns they ran were incredibly visionary. The mobilization for that level of office was incredible, and I'm hoping that we're able to pick that up, in the future. I will just say that what are the lessons there? I can't do too much, armchair quarterbacking of those, because I think that the effort that was put forward was very serious, and the hurdles and challenges that people had to face were immense. I think the big things for people who were sort of watching from the outside was that internally the kind of party apparatus and also just kind of like social organizations, including like organizations like the Austin Chronicle, didn't give out the endorsements to Bob or Andrew, which is a joke, and we can roast them for that. But unfortunately, like the way that most people vote on these kind of in these primaries is they rely on those a lot. So that's obviously that's difficult, and you can't blame the campaigns for not getting those. And two, I think that this is just something that for people here is just like there is this, particularly with Bob's race versus Bridget Shea, there really is a fissure going on between people who consider themselves to be liberals here, between people like us who are advocating for more pro-worker policies, being more serious about corporate power, and things like that, and a kind of traditional liberal base. I'm from Austin, right? And I talked to and I grew up primarily with liberal family members and things like that. And I even though people are working class, right, you talk to them, say, look, who should I support in this election or that election? And I'll say, like, here's a list. I send them something, and then I'll get a message back being like, well, why are you against this person? They're my friend. I've known them for 30 years, right? Like there is a kind of established liberal base here in Austin that shows up for these primary elections. As we were saying, these were historically high, but they're still low when you look at the percentage, that those people show up for these elections. And like, that's a difficult bridge, for us to find ways to turn people who are interested in our policies into active voters to our policies. Cause I can tell you this right now, right? If the people who are living in the districts where Andrew was running and the districts where Bob were running, for example, had watched the conversations that we had here on Left Reckoning with those candidates, I can promise you, people would have been, people would have been open and wanting those ideas to be successful. The problem is turning people who are interested in these ideas into voters. And obviously this is ground game. This is organizing. This is all this kind of stuff. This is not a criticism of the campaign. It's just recognizing that, like, there's always a kind of, I don't know, push sometimes after we lose an election to say, like, well, we needed to do like this kind of messaging, or like, oh, we went too far in this or that, right? Instead of the realization that like overcoming these fucking really entrenched machines is hard, and turning situations where we have low participation in our democracy into high participation takes time. We can't use those as excuses, but we should also like try to draw the right lessons, instead of scrapping the playbook. And I'm not saying this, I don't think anybody involved is thinking that. I'm just we covered this on our show, so I figured I might as well just sort of tell people how I'm feeling about it on the other side. I hope both of them run again, in the near future, in the next cycle. From Andrew's like reimagining of using these kind of justice positions to create a much more humane system, I think that that's something that is not only viable, but is actually really important. To Bob taking very, very seriously the responsibility of the Travis County Commission to look out for working people instead of giving fucking millions of dollars to people like Elon Musk, who we'll be talking about in a couple minutes. I'm very, very proud of those campaigns that they run, and I'm hoping that there's more and much more of that in the future.
Yeah, I mean, I think the most positive way to look at it, in a way that I don't think is entirely like lacking in substance, is you have to build institutional knowledge with how this stuff is, and like this sort of. I think we're seeing a rise in awareness and the type of candidates we are getting, and they aren't going to win the first time. My buddy Chris Leal ran in State House District 114, lost. But like at the same time, he lost to the person who got the Dallas Morning News endorsement. But he went through and built connections with the AFT. Like he got a whole bunch of union endorsements and that sort of stuff. And you run again, a couple of years, and you see what happens. And hopefully, like, you build up to the point where you can put, even if a candidate does beat you, you put them on the record about something that if they cross it, then it can become a future rallying point, a future point of criticism and education. So I think it is. yeah, I mean, I'm glad we got some decent
Mm-hmm.
progressives, and keep the ball rolling.
Yep. And like the thing is, like, beyond everything though, like, progressive politics and left politics in Texas is alive and well. And, with each challenge, we only get stronger and our numbers only grow. So I'm really, really looking forward to that.